Food trucks. No, don't go crazy yet. Food trucks. Apparently, they've made some sort of compromise down at City Hall. They were going to say that you had to be about 50 meters away from the closest bricks and mortar restaurant. But now it's 30 meters away from the closest bricks and mortar restaurant. Now, what is a food truck? It's a truck that sells food. It could be hot dogs and hamburgers, but usually what we're talking about is kind of higher end food. Most of these trucks specialize in one thing, like fancy tacos with pulled pork or something like that, or maybe some sort of ethnic cuisine. So there's been this fear City Hall has because they want to, I don't know, people have such a hard time accepting change. You know, we're defending a broken taxi system against Uber, and now we're defending bricks and mortar restaurants, which, by the way, I don't think are going anywhere. And I'd love somebody to give me the argument that in other cities, that when food trucks come into a certain area, that it hurts the retail of the bricks and mortar restaurant. How many times do you say to yourself, hey, let's go out to a restaurant for dinner? And then as you're walking down your street, you get sidetracked by the hot dog cart and you're like, freak it, we'll just have a hot dog and then go home. Happens all the time, doesn't it? No, it never happens. Why am I getting so angry about this? Because it's just absolutely ridiculous. Whether it's alcohol in this province or this city in its antiquated way on how we are licensing food trucks. So, we're joined right now by a gentleman by the name of Tony Elenis. Tony is the president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association, a job that I used to have. Tony, thank you very much for your time.
Jim, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
I love to give people pleasure, Tony. So, what's the fear that a food truck, if it came next to your restaurant or somebody's restaurant, what are people afraid of?
First of all, let me talk about a myth that our organization has food truck members as well as brick and mortar members.
Okay.
And we want both to be sustained, but not on the sacrifice of brick and mortar restaurants. And there are reasons for that. There are more restaurants going out of business than any other business, any other sector. The province of Ontario performance with food service across the board has the lowest profit margin than any other province, whether they're small, large, east, or west. And there have been so many burdens to the expense lines, to the revenue lines over the recent years,
yep,
that many are challenged just to stay open.
But I got to say that I would dispute. You have the numbers in front of you, and numbers, I guess.
Those are statistics.
Well, okay, but my point would be that Toronto has never seen as thriving of an industry as it is seeing right now. So how could you tell me that, yeah, there are probably tons of restaurants going out of business, but there are just as many restaurants that are thriving and starting in new communities and people bending over backwards trying to get storefronts to start the next successful restaurant?
It's a great question.
Thank you.
It's not about the lineups. You can go down to very popular restaurants down on King Street, specifically small business restaurants. Their margins are the 1% mark. That's pretty tough to stay open. And what we've seen, it has unintentional consequences. We have youth unemployment. 35% of all youth work in this industry, and this industry has been hit hard with labor, with energy, utilities, and food commodities that we all have been impacted as consumers as well.
Okay, I don't think there's any question that restaurant ownership is probably one of the toughest business. You make a very compelling argument, but I would like you to tell me if there are any other jurisdictions that you can prove that the food trucks take away business. Because if I'm going to a restaurant, I'm not going to be happy with sitting on the curb eating my fancy pulled pork taco. So we'll ask you that question in a second as this city tries to make strides and be as civil as some other great cities with thriving restaurants and food trucks. That in a moment with Tony Elenis. I'm Jim Richards, 145. News Talk 1010, Time Saver Traffic. This is In-Depth Radio in Toronto, News Talk 1010. Food trucks are now allowed to get within 30 meters of bricks and mortar restaurants. There was a fear, and probably still is, that these things would come around and they would hurt the restaurant industry. There is no question, as our guest has made a very great argument, that the restaurant industry is a tough one to stay afloat in. But would food trucks really be the reason that would put a bricks and mortar out of business? That seems to be the argument. So 416-872-1010, Star Talk is star 8255. Again, Tony Elenis is with us. He's the president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association. But Tony, I think that the great argument that you make for restaurants being a competitive business, I think that's because of other restaurants. Can you actually tell me that the thriving food truck industry, and that's, trucks that would go into a neighborhood and make their fancy pulled pork or whatever they choose to make, hurt bricks and mortar?
Yeah, a lunch is a lunch, Jim. Especially as you defined it, these are not your typical hot dog, French fry trucks. These supply a meal. I've had calls directly to me from food court operators underground in Toronto that have created a business over so many years that have lost major traffic whenever there's food trucks in specific areas, private areas, which are still allowed in Toronto. That is tangible evidence.
But don't they get upset, too, when, Quiznos or Subway or Burger Priest just opened up across the street? I mean, what really is the difference?
Right. Great question.
Thank you.
And I can explain it that those kind of places are brick and mortar with fixed expenses, growing jobs, putting back money in the community, and investing. The variance between a food truck operation and a brick and mortar restaurant is significant. And when it comes to regulations, we hate regulations. We're probably in a very extreme regulated industry like no other. And there are ancient laws and political beliefs in the city with alcohol that need to change to progress the city. So we understand regulation more than any other industry.
You probably have more red tape than most industries. I think that's
absolutely
a very good point. But okay, let's talk about this city has a thriving restaurant industry. You're right to point out that it's hard to make it in the restaurant industry, but it's a brilliant, vibrant, blossoming industry in this city. You'd think of cities like Chicago or Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland that also have very healthy restaurant industries. None of them have really been hurt by what they also have there, which is a great food truck industry.
Now, the geographical setup of the city of Toronto is totally different than Los Angeles and some of the other cities you mentioned. This is more dense and more restaurants per block than the cities you mentioned. But every one of those cities has a proximity regulation on it. Every city has it with the exception of New York, and New York has a totally different type of demand generator than all the cities, including Toronto. But when it comes to the flexibility, and one area that we're disappointed with is that the city instructed and directed a task force made up of licensing staff, stakeholders, including food truck, restaurants, and experts on the table for over a year to study the situation, study those geographical areas that you are referring to. And they presented a report to council, to the licensee members, that had a lot of flexibility in it, that there would be prorated cost over a year because you cannot operate a food truck in the winter. Why should you pay for a 12-month period? We agree with that there should be a 5-hour time slot when they're parked in a specific destination. We agree with that. The proximity item was the only one that we did not agree. But,
all right, listen, I'm almost out of time. Are you okay with the 30-meter rule?
But we agreed to 30. We're flexible. The other side, I guess, wanted 15. So it's a happy medium at this point.
Good stuff then, Tony. I'm glad that hopefully both businesses can thrive and contribute to a great city, which we have.
We hate regulation. I'm glad I hear you saying that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Tony, I appreciate it. Tony Elenis is the president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association. So let's hear from you.